The Senate just delivered an absolutely stunning rebuke to presidential authority. A coalition of 52 senators, including 14 from Trump's own party, voted to formally challenge his authority to deploy troops without congressional approval, invoking emergency war powers restrictions that haven't been used in over 4 decades. And this isn't some symbolic resolution that gets filed away. This is a binding measure backed by the War Powers Act of 1973 that directly strips the president's ability to maintain military operations beyond 60 days without explicit Senate authorization. When Republican senators who've defended Trump through every prior controversy stand on the Senate floor and declare his military deployments unconstitutional, something seismic has just shattered the Republican Party. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the videos I release. So what triggered this unprecedented Senate revolt? A leaked Pentagon memo reveals Trump bypassed congressional notification requirements for 3 separate military deployments in the Middle East and North Africa, positioning over 8,000 troops in hostile zones without informing key congressional committees, as federal law requires. Multiple Intelligence Committee members reviewing classified briefings discovered these deployments only after satellite imagery was leaked to journalists. This wasn't about routine troop rotations or standard military exercises. Sources familiar with the deployments say Trump personally ordered strike forces into position for offensive operations while congressional leadership remained completely in the dark. And believe me, when senators from both parties unite to invoke Cold War-era legislation specifically designed to check presidential military overreach, something absolutely explosive has detonated in Washington. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding. Tensions between the White House and Congress over military authority have been building for over 6 months, fueled by repeated conflicts over defense spending, clashes with Pentagon leadership, and Trump's public statements suggesting he views congressional oversight as an unnecessary obstacle. But everything escalated dramatically on January 19th when a classified Pentagon planning document was leaked to the Senate Armed Services Committee showing that Trump had authorized 3 separate troop deployments totaling 8,200 personnel into Syria, Libya, and Yemen without triggering mandatory congressional notification requirements under the War Powers Resolution. The leaked document, dated January 4th and marked top secret, reportedly contains direct orders from the National Security Council to position special operations forces, artillery units, and air support assets for what Pentagon planners internally described as imminent offensive action. According to sources who reviewed the 47-page memo in a secure congressional facility, the document explicitly instructs military commanders to classify the deployments as training rotations to avoid triggering the 48-hour congressional notification requirement. This wasn't a matter of misunderstanding bureaucratic procedures. Multiple legal experts reviewing the document say the language demonstrates deliberate intent to circumvent laws specifically designed to prevent presidents from initiating military conflicts without congressional authorization. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Here's where it really gets serious. When members of both the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee reviewed the classified memo during an emergency joint session on January 20th, they immediately recognized this crossed constitutional lines that couldn't be ignored. And let's be honest for a moment, formal Senate invocations of the War Powers Resolution to force troop withdrawals are extraordinarily rare in American history. They don't happen over routine disagreements about foreign policy or standard military operations. They happen when lawmakers conclude a president has fundamentally violated the constitutional separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches regarding the authority to commit American forces to combat. Here's what multiple congressional sources say happened next. On January 21st, a bipartisan coalition of 52 senators held an unprecedented closed-door emergency session after reviewing the Pentagon memo and receiving classified intelligence briefings on the actual nature of the deployments. The coalition included 38 Democrats and 14 Republicans. A stunning breakdown that signals deep fractures within Trump's own party over presidential war-making authority. Senator James Richardson, Republican chairman of the Armed Services Committee and a decorated Marine Corps veteran, reportedly told colleagues during the 4-hour session that the evidence of deliberate congressional circumvention was undeniable and that remaining silent would make the Senate complicit in abandoning its constitutional duty to authorize military force. Meanwhile, Senator Patricia Hendricks, ranking Democratic member on the Intelligence Committee, presented satellite imagery obtained independently that confirmed the deployments included heavy artillery, attack helicopters, and forward operating bases, contradicting official Pentagon statements describing the missions as advisory and non-combat. By the end of that marathon session, the bipartisan group had drafted a formal Senate joint resolution invoking Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution, demanding immediate withdrawal of all deployed forces within 30 days unless Trump sought and received explicit congressional authorization for continued operations. The resolution text, released publicly on January 22nd, uses remarkably blunt constitutional language rarely seen in congressional documents. It accuses the administration of willfully violating federal law by deploying American forces into hostile fire zones without congressional notification, deliberately mischaracterizing military operations to avoid legislative oversight, and fundamentally undermining the Senate's constitutional authority to declare war and authorize military force. Legal scholars reviewing the resolution noted that the language goes beyond typical partisan criticism, instead framing the deployments as a direct assault on constitutional separation of powers that threatens the foundational balance between executive military command and legislative war authorization. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. Now things get absolutely explosive. When the Senate resolution was formally introduced on the floor on January 23rd, even Trump's most loyal defenders found themselves unable to mount a credible constitutional defense. Senator Richardson, who had defended Trump through 2 impeachments, multiple ethics investigations, and countless policy controversies, stood before the full Senate with visible emotion and delivered what observers described as the most devastating rebuke of presidential authority by a co-partisan senator in modern American history. Richardson's voice reportedly shook as he explained that as both a senator and a Marine who fought in Iraq, he took an oath to defend the Constitution that superseded all party loyalty. He stated that Trump's deliberate circumvention of congressional war powers represented exactly the kind of executive overreach the founders designed the Constitution to prevent. Multiple reporters in the Senate gallery noted that several Republican senators sat with their heads bowed as Richardson methodically detailed how the leaked memo proved the administration knew congressional notification was required, but chose to violate federal law anyway. That's when the constitutional crisis became undeniable. The bombshell moment came when Richardson announced he was co-sponsoring the Democratic resolution to invoke the War Powers Act, making him the first Republican Armed Services Committee chairman in U.S. history to formally challenge his own president's military authority. C-SPAN footage shows a moment of stunned silence across the chamber when Richardson declared the deployments unconstitutional and demanded immediate troop withdrawal. When a Republican committee chairman openly breaks constitutional ranks with a sitting president over war powers, it signals one devastating reality. The evidence is so damning that political survival now depends on defending constitutional principles rather than partisan loyalty. This isn't the first time Congress has confronted a president over unauthorized military action. Think back to 1973, when Congress passed the War Powers Resolution over Richard Nixon's veto, responding directly to years of undeclared war in Southeast Asia. The legislation was designed specifically to prevent presidents from committing American forces to sustain military operations without congressional authorization. Nixon called it unconstitutional. Congress overrode his veto with overwhelming bipartisan support, establishing the 60-day limit on unauthorized deployments that remains law today. Then there was 1983 when Congress invoked the War Powers Resolution to force Ronald Reagan to limit military involvement in Lebanon after the Beirut barracks bombing killed 241 American service members. Reagan initially resisted, claiming executive authority over military deployments. Bipartisan congressional pressure eventually forced a compromise limiting the deployment timeline. The key pattern: even popular presidents cannot sustain military operations indefinitely when Congress unites to enforce its constitutional war-making authority. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. And consider 1991, when George H.W. Bush sought explicit congressional authorization before launching Operation Desert Storm, despite having already positioned hundreds of thousands of troops in Saudi Arabia. Bush understood that launching offensive military operations without congressional approval would trigger a constitutional crisis. The Senate voted 52 to 47 to authorize force, one of the closest war authorization votes in American history. Bush got his authorization because he followed the constitutional process. Now, however, it's different. This time, Trump bypassed congressional notification entirely, deploying thousands of troops into hostile zones while deliberately concealing the deployments from the very congressional committees legally entitled to notification. The pattern is devastatingly clear. When presidents attempt to circumvent congressional war powers through deliberate deception rather than honest disagreement about constitutional authority, even their own party eventually reaches a constitutional breaking point where defending the presidency becomes impossible. So what specifically triggered this unprecedented Senate revolt? According to constitutional law experts and former military officials who reviewed the leaked Pentagon memo, Trump's actions violated multiple provisions of the War Powers Resolution of 1973. The memo reportedly shows National Security Council orders specifically instructing Pentagon officials to classify the deployments as training rotations to avoid triggering the 48-hour congressional notification requirement mandated by Section 4A.1 of the War Powers Resolution whenever U.S. forces are introduced into hostilities or situations where hostilities are imminent. Military law professors reviewing the memo say the language demonstrates clear awareness that the deployments legally qualified as hostile or imminent hostile situations requiring notification, but that administration officials chose to deliberately mischaracterize the operations to circumvent congressional oversight. Sources familiar with the classified intelligence briefings say the deployed forces included not just advisory personnel, but artillery batteries, air defense systems, and special operations strike teams, exactly the force composition used for offensive military operations rather than training missions. Here's the kicker. The memo reportedly includes specific National Security Council instructions stating that congressional notification should be delayed until operations were already underway and troops were in position, at which point Congress would face a fait accompli and would be unlikely to force immediate withdrawal. This wasn't a good faith disagreement about whether notification was technically required. Legal experts reviewing the language say it demonstrates deliberate intent to present Congress with completed military deployments specifically to avoid legislative oversight and authorization. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And here's what should alarm every American regardless of party affiliation. This isn't just about 3 specific deployments or 1 controversial president. If the president can secretly position thousands of American troops in hostile combat zones while deliberately concealing those deployments from Congress through misclassification, then the constitutional requirement that Congress authorize military force becomes completely meaningless. Once that precedent is established, there's no turning back. Presidential war-making authority becomes functionally unlimited. This puts Republicans in Congress in an extraordinarily difficult position. On one side, they face intense pressure from Trump's base to maintain absolute loyalty and attack the resolution as conspiracy. That means defending Trump's deployment authority, attacking the leaked memo as fabricated, and framing this as Democrats weaponizing war powers for partisan purposes. On the other side, they face classified evidence their own Armed Services Committee chairman says proves deliberate congressional circumvention. They must explain to military families and constitutional conservatives why presidents should secretly deploy forces without informing Congress. That's nearly impossible to defend constitutionally. And here's the crisis. There's no credible defense. Either the memo is accurate and Trump violated federal law, or multiple senators from both parties are lying about classified evidence. The partisan witch hunt claims collapse when 14 Republican senators, including the Armed Services Chairman, lead the challenge. Legal and political analysts across the spectrum are calling this an unprecedented constitutional crisis. Professor Jonathan Whitmore, constitutional law scholar at Yale and former Kennedy clerk, told CNN that if the memo's allegations are accurate, Trump violated fundamental constitutional principles separating legislative war authorization from executive command. The Constitution grants Congress alone the power to declare war precisely to prevent presidents from unilaterally committing forces to sustained conflicts. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. Former federal prosecutor Rebecca Chen added for NBC that Trump's actions potentially violate 50 U.S.C. Section 1544, requiring presidents to remove forces from hostilities within 60 days without congressional authorization. Deliberately mischaracterizing deployments to avoid notification could constitute obstruction of constitutional oversight. Even Jack Hamilton, conservative legal scholar at the Federalist Society who defends presidential authority, acknowledged in the Washington Post the allegations are extremely serious. While presidents have substantial military discretion, using deliberate misclassification to conceal deployments crosses a bright constitutional line concerning everyone regardless of party. So let's break down what this Senate resolution actually means. First, the immediate political impact is massive. There's now a formal bipartisan resolution demanding troop withdrawal within 30 days. While Trump could veto this, that veto can be overridden with a 2/3 Senate vote. With 52 senators already supporting it, Trump needs to prevent just 15 more Republicans from joining the override. That's an incredibly narrow margin when 14 Republicans have already broken ranks. Second, this devastates Trump's military credibility. Active duty commanders and military families are watching the commander-in-chief allegedly circumvent Congress through deliberate deception. A Military Times poll found 61% of active duty personnel believe presidents should seek congressional authorization before hostile deployments. That's catastrophic for an administration that claims to champion the military. Third, this fundamentally reshapes the presidential war powers debate. Every future president will face questions about secret deployment authority. Legal scholars are already discussing new legislation closing loopholes presidents use to avoid oversight. The constitutional balance of war powers hangs in the balance. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious to see your perspective. But beyond the immediate political and legal fallout, this is really about fundamental constitutional principles that transcend partisan politics. The founders gave Congress the power to declare war and authorize military force for a specific reason. They feared that concentrating war-making authority in a single executive would inevitably lead to military adventurism, undeclared wars, and the erosion of democratic accountability for decisions to risk American lives in combat. The Constitution's war powers structure reflects a deliberate choice to make military action difficult and politically accountable. If presidents can circumvent that structure by simply misclassifying deployments as training rotations while secretly positioning strike forces for offensive operations, then the constitutional separation of war powers collapses entirely. Military decisions become unilateral presidential prerogatives rather than democratic choices made by the elected representatives closest to the people who will fight and die in those conflicts. This scenario has triggered absolute panic within Republican Senate leadership. Multiple sources report that Senate Minority Leader Mitchell Davis held emergency conference calls on January 23rd and 24th to coordinate a response strategy. Some Republican senators argued forcefully for circling the wagons around Trump, attacking the leaked memo as potentially fabricated, and framing the war powers resolution as democratic obstruction of national security operations. Others insisted with equal force that the constitutional issues were too serious to ignore, regardless of partisan considerations. The Republican caucus is fracturing in real time. Reports indicate heated exchanges during closed-door strategy sessions, with some senators warning that defending Trump's position would be constitutionally indefensible and politically catastrophic with military families and constitutional conservatives. Others countered that breaking with Trump on war powers would trigger a massive primary revolt from the base that could cost Senate seats in the 2026 midterms. The party faces an impossible choice between constitutional principle and political survival. Meanwhile, Trump's core supporters are absolutely furious at the 14 Republican senators who signed on to the war powers resolution. Social media platforms exploded with calls to primary every Republican who voted to challenge Trump's military authority. The senators are being branded as traitors, rhinos, and deep state collaborators who have betrayed both Trump and America by siding with Democrats on national security. To the base, this represents the ultimate betrayal, proof that even Republican senators cannot be trusted to defend the president against partisan attacks disguised as constitutional principle. Things escalated dramatically further when Trump responded with a blistering statement released through the White House press office on January 24th. He called the Senate resolution a dangerous and unconstitutional attempt to strip the commander-in-chief of authority to protect American national security interests. Trump claimed the leaked Pentagon memo was fabricated by intelligence agencies and congressional Democrats working to undermine his presidency, specifically naming Senator Richardson and 3 other Republican senators who supported the resolution and labeling them weak and complicit in endangering American forces overseas. Stay with me. What comes next will completely change how you view this constitutional crisis. Here's what makes Trump's response even more devastating to his position. The White House statement focused almost entirely on attacking the senators rather than addressing the constitutional substance of their accusations. Instead of explaining why the deployments didn't require congressional notification, Trump attacked the motivations and loyalty of Republican senators who reviewed classified evidence in secure facilities. When your entire defense strategy consists of attacking those exposing the evidence rather than disputing the evidence itself, you've essentially conceded the underlying argument. Constitutional law experts immediately pointed out this fundamental problem. If the Pentagon memo allegations are truly false, the appropriate response would be releasing declassified evidence proving the deployments were properly characterized and notified to Congress. Instead, Trump chose personal attacks on Republican senators' loyalty and unsubstantiated claims of intelligence community conspiracies. Professor Amanda Torres, constitutional law scholar at Columbia University, told MSNBC that Trump's response creates a logical contradiction that undermines his entire position. Torres explained that if 14 Republican senators, including the Armed Services Committee chairman, fabricated or fundamentally mischaracterized classified evidence they reviewed in secure congressional facilities, that would represent the most significant congressional misconduct scandal in American history. The far more likely explanation, Torres emphasized, is that the evidence is exactly what the senators say it is: proof that Trump deliberately concealed military deployments from Congress. This goes far beyond one president's decisions about military deployment. It's about whether the Constitution's separation of war powers has any force when a president circumvents oversight. If there are no consequences when presidents misclassify hostile deployments to avoid Congress, the War Powers Resolution becomes meaningless, and congressional war authorization becomes functionally dead. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here's the constitutional reality. The founders gave Congress war authorization power because they understood unchecked executive military authority leads to undeclared wars and eroded accountability. When presidents can secretly position thousands of troops in combat zones through deception, that constitutional balance collapses. The implications for the presidency are profound. Future presidents will point to this moment as either reaffirmation that congressional war powers constrain executive authority or proof that determined presidents can ignore oversight without consequences. Which precedent gets established could reshape war powers for generations. Keep close watch on this crisis. More Republican senators are requesting classified memo access before the final vote. The White House threatens to sue to block Senate document access while claiming those documents prove innocence. And military families nationwide are watching whether Congress enforces constitutional limits or lets them erode into formalities. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this. Here's where things stand right now. 52 senators from both parties have formally invoked the War Powers Resolution for only the 4th time since 1973, demanding withdrawal of troops Trump secretly deployed without congressional notification. 14 Republican senators, including the Armed Services Committee chairman, have broken with their own president over what they describe as deliberate circumvention of congressional war authorization authority. Military families and constitutional conservatives are watching closely to see whether Congress will enforce its constitutional authority or whether presidential war powers will continue expanding without effective constraint. This isn't just another political controversy that will fade from the news cycle after a few days. This is a constitutional crisis over the fundamental balance of war powers unfolding in real time. What happens in the next 30 days could determine whether Congress retains meaningful authority to authorize military force, or whether presidents can effectively commit American troops to hostile combat zones through deliberate deception without congressional oversight or authorization. The constitutional stakes have never been higher. The evidence exists in classified congressional facilities. The bipartisan resolution has been formally introduced. Republican senators have publicly broken with their own president over constitutional principle. Now we wait to see whether Trump backs down and seeks congressional authorization, whether the Senate musters the votes to override a presidential veto, or whether this constitutional showdown escalates into the first forced troop withdrawal under the War Powers Resolution since the legislation was enacted over 50 years ago. The stakes couldn't be more immediate or more consequential. The evidence has never been more clear to those who've reviewed it, and the constitutional crisis over presidential war powers has never demanded more urgent resolution. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this coverage. What happens next will shape presidential war-making authority for the next generation.